Okay, so we're getting started in the first lesson of Module 1. Module 1, we will be going over some different aspects about relationships. And so in this chapter 1 of our text, we're talking about developing caring relationships with children and with their families. The book is aimed toward a little bit more of an elementary and secondary teacher audience, so they are obviously focused on student and classroom. But in our cases, I don't really know what you all plan to do with your degree, so some of you may very well end up going ending up in that environment where you're teaching in a classroom. Some of you may be in more early child care settings, or early interventionists, or therapists, or different occupations like that. So what we're going to focus on in this chapter is a little bit of what we are going to pull out of the text that we read that might relate to a lot of those types of positions. So in a nutshell, we're talking about the relationship between adult and child, or adult and children. And something that right off the bat was mentioned in the reading was the degree to which positive relationships and engaged environments really add to the potential of children to develop in ways that would benefit them and their families. It's a really important thing to remember, especially in early child care or in early childhood development, because they're within the span of time in their lives when their development is very, very dependent on the relationships with people in their lives. The caregivers that they have, be them parents or other family members, or child care workers and teachers and things, actually aids in the development, the physical developmental structures of their brain that they need in order to successfully navigate life and relationships. So that's it's like no pressure, right? Because what you're giving them is not necessarily a bundle of knowledge, but thorough felt experiences of other people, and they learn how to have relationships that will follow them through their lives, and they also learn how to be themselves by being around us, the adults in their lives. So it's in that vein that we can consider relationships as tools, and your skill in developing a caring and nurturing relationship as a skill that can be sharpened, or a tool that can be sharpened. The book gives a pretty good list of some traits of what they consider to be a caring or nurturing type of adult. And that list could go on forever, of course, but it's worth thinking about which of those you feel you really exhibit on a regular basis to other people, maybe specifically with children, and which of those you might have a hard time expressing, even if you feel the ones that they list there. If you feel empathy for others, is it typically difficult for you? Do you have to make a lot of effort to show that empathy, to show that you're thinking about what it's like to live in their shoes? Or is it quite natural to you and you don't even notice you're doing it sometimes? That's worth knowing those things, because if you want to show empathy but you don't normally, then you might have to actually try to give some effort to making your face look empathic, to adjusting your body language or your tone of voice to let them know that you're feeling that empathy for them. I thought it was a very interesting an interesting fact that was mentioned in the book, that they've noticed that as teacher or adult increase in control occurs over the students decrease in their success in academic and even conduct achievements. Well, it was very interesting, because we normally think of a highly regulated, highly structured environment as being really important, which it is, but the control is something that's really specific, that doesn't have to be there as tightly, and actually shouldn't be there quite as tightly. So it might be that we're talking about that they're aiming at kind of demonstrating a balance between a free-for-all in a group of children or in a relationship with a child versus a rigidly tight absolute rule-based kind of relationship or environment with children, and where the middle ground is, and that might be most beneficial. So when you're interacting with each child, say you're working with a group of children and you're interacting with one child in a certain moment, it's really important to be able to express a degree of authentic interest in the way that you relate to them. Some ways that they suggested in the text was to reach out to them with initial contacts. Now that's a little different depending on what job you're in, but that initial contact is pretty important. It allows them to see you as a human being and a person who they can feel comfortable with. Building rapport is an essential part of any service-based job where you're interacting with people, especially with children. And the rapport itself is the relationship, which is the tool that you're using to get the job done, which is the job being to help the child develop as best that you can. Authentic interest is something I want to point out as being really essential here. Authentic interest can be really difficult to muster sometimes. However, there are ways of doing it, even if you're being told the same story 1,000 times or something like that from a child or someone else. There are ways that one can sort of train oneself to pour their interest into a person no matter what they're talking about. So interest you might think of as being, well, if they're talking about something or if they're describing something I already have interest in, that would be where interest lies. And that's true. However, the interest in the person might kind of transcend the topic that they're discussing. Your interest in the child's experience of whatever it was that they enjoyed or they had interest in might very well be enough to show them that interest. So experiment in your relationships with a level of interest in engagement. You don't have to exactly even care about what the person's describing for you to display a level of interest in them. And that's probably key, that you're interested in them even above what they might be talking about. Okay, so special populations that are outlined in this text are cultural and linguistic diversity, and those with special needs and those with gifts and talents. And I want to point out the fact that we're already looking at different ways in which a person-first approach or attitude can influence our language, which we'll talk more about later on in the course. But the way that the text put this, however, I've noticed that to frame culturally and linguistically diverse children is a little bit less person first than they seem to be encouraging us to use. What diversity is not something one person has or is, as much as a description of the environment that person is a part of. And what I mean by that is I have traits that might be more or less a majority in a certain group of people and a minority in a certain group of people, and that is a description of me in reference to other people. And that's what diversity is describing, is that context. So it's worth thinking about person-first language in relation to diversity as well. So that's just something to think about. However, when we describe diversity as being or if we describe a person as being culturally or linguistically diverse, as they put it in the book, that generally just means that they're in a minority. And the numbers games add up so that there's less people with that trait that they have than not. And that is important to know, because there are risk factors that have seemed to emerge with that type of situation, where if a person is a non-English speaker and everyone else is, of course there's going to be risk factors. There's difficulties with that. It's worth noting also that there's a fluctuation of the population. The balances of different cultural groups and ethnic groups and things is constantly in flux. So the book is already pretty out of date, I believe, in the ways that it's presenting things. which is, I mean, that's understandable. That's to be expected. So with children with disabilities, it's important to know how prevalent that actually is, and no matter where you're working, if you're working with children, it's likely you'll be in some role of shared responsibility. It's worth also noting a little bit about the specifics of the Individuals with Education of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act and the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Section 504. Those are really specific school-related, like secondary or elementary on up, school-related things. But if you're going to be there, you should know or have familiarity with those things. As with all groups of people, finding strengths and using strengths and cultivating strengths to help build on areas of challenge is really the way to go. And that's no exception, and maybe even more important with children with disabilities. Children with gifts and talents is an interesting field. Gifts, the term, is not very well defined. It's kind of difficult to nail down. However, it does seem as though, again, likened to the diversity idea, gifts or giftedness is something that's in relation to others, and it's a statistical relation. So children generally who are considered gifted or talented tend to exceed beyond those who are their peers in certain specific ways, like academically, creatively, artistically, and even in leadership, relationship types of ways. One thing to notice is that those who do fit that mold, who are a little bit above the achievement of those around them, they tend to get pretty bored, because if they're in an environment where they're not being stimulated intellectually, then it's a human response to feel bored and want to look in other places for that stimulation. So it will be the professional, the adult's role, the job, to actually provide that stimulation for them, and that can be a challenge. And it's also important to notice that those who tend to achieve high, they come to expect themselves to achieve high, which means that when they don't feel like they do, it can create a lot of anxiety. And part of what builds the relationship, a really important part, as we'll come to see even next week for our discussion about attachment, is the ability of the adults to help soothe the child and how to help teach them soothe themselves. It's a really essential part of the emotional development of the child in the relationship with the adult as well. Okay, a little bit about backgrounds of family. You have to know more about the background of the family in order to more deeply know the child. And one principle to keep in mind is that all families consist of what are called systems or complex systems. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we go along in the course too. But in a nutshell and oversimplified, a system of a family system is basically one in which every member, every individual is mutually impacted and impacting of other members. And you can think of that as something like the ripple effect, as being hard at work in families constantly. You do have to know what the configuration of the family is. That basically just means who's considered family member, who's considered immediate family or close family, who takes care of who makes what decisions, who has certain roles. And that is a kind of extensive data gathering process, and it has to be done sensitively. You can't just walk up and say, hey, how much money do you make, and who decides who spends it? That'd be pretty less than tactful. But there are different ways to kind of glean information about families so you can fill in those blanks for yourself and then know what to expect of them and how they expect things from you. But it will be important to gather really practical things about them. Work schedule, especially for like pickup and drop-off time, if that's a part of your job. But other things that might impact the child, like the way they spend their free time, weekends, nights, or whatever time they're not working. So those are just things, and those you could ask pretty directly about. Say like, hey, what's your work schedule like, or what do you guys do on the weekend, or that kind of thing. So the culturally and linguistically diverse, I've shortened that CLD like they did in the text. It's worth thinking about the fact that there's a two-way road happening that can very well lead to different things that are reflections of miscommunication or misunderstanding. If a person is unfamiliar with a different type of culture or way of being, then there's going to be discomfort there, and there's going to be some uneasiness. That's a very natural response, and it's actually the way that our bodies are supposed to tell us to scan for difference and anomaly. Now, when we meet people who are anomalous, or we should call them novel or unique, that means different than us, then we, as developed human beings, can decide to pour an engaged interest in that novelty as opposed to pull away from it in fear and anxiety. Now, that, again, is two-way. You do your job in trying to maintain an openness to difference and novelty, and they are tasked with doing that for themselves, and they may very well not. And if they do meet you with a type of resistance, that's just something that you're going to have to deal with through communication skills that we'll talk about later in the course as well. Okay, so raising the children with disabilities, there are multiple unique stressors and challenges and needs that a family with a child with a disability that they have. And it'll be your job to scan for that and to try to even record it so that you can stay on top of what those are for them. There is often an assumed negative impact in a family with a child with disabilities, but it's fairly common when that happens and a family handles the diagnosis well. It very well could become one of the more important things about their family, how they drew together and faced a challenge, how they continually grow and become stronger and more resilient together, that it can actually become a really positive part of their lives, and it should, or at least it could be most beneficial to. The only thing I'd mention about the children with gifts and talents is that you may very well notice that they will act quite a bit differently in different settings. The example that was given in the book was a really good one, where during a certain reading time engagement in a classroom, a student might be really bored or seem uninterested, but then in community centers or libraries, they may be very interested in literacy. And those things can be really hidden, and that can be difficult to find. But if you're working with much younger children, you might not have that exact kind of scenario. So family strengths, thinking of family strengths as being always a possible tool is a good idea. Discovering strengths can be difficult because they're somewhat hidden sometimes, maybe because you don't necessarily interact with the adults of the family very often. But if you maintain an open door policy and maintain openness toward them, typically they can kind of be highlighted themselves. And I would say I like the idea that, and I'm a therapist, so I'd better like this idea, or I'd have trouble in my job. But it does seem to be the case. It does seem to be true that if one really knows how to listen to another person, then no one is boring. No one has nothing to offer. No one is deplete of any strength or interest or talent or uniqueness. And it might be thought of as your job as the adult in the lives of these children and their families to be a very skilled listener and communicator, to be able to find those strengths, maybe even for them. They might not even know what they are. Sharing expertise is a concept that might very well be used for offering for the parents and families of the child that you might be working with to share their own strengths with you and let the child witness that, or to share it with the child or other children around them and let their child witness them exemplify their strengths. That can really teach the child how to recognize strength in themselves and how to show it appropriately, not pridefully or not timidly, but something in between that's beneficial to all. So lastly, understanding family concerns. I think it's worth thinking of concerns that families might have as being local or global, and there's a lot of course, medium in between there. But local concerns might more directly impact you, and you might very well have more responsibility over them. So if a parent brings a certain local concern to you, it may be a time for you to engage in a type of either negotiation or different types of listening strategies and problem solving to be able to respond to it. And we're going to go over maintaining a professional stance later in the term where we'll go over things like negotiation. Now, global concerns might sort of be over your head, and I don't mean that you don't understand them, it's just you might not have influence over decision making for what they're concerned with. And this is a good opportunity. Some When you can find a way to be able to uh, to connect with the parents or the family members of a child by recognizing that they're struggling with something and have a concern with something, and maybe even share in that struggle with them, then that can very well bond or begin a bond of relationship with them that will turn into something that can involve a lot of trust. So, and there's a delicate line to balance. If you're working in an institution and they have a concern, it's a global concern with the institution, you can't necessarily throw the institution under the bus and say, I'm with you 100%, this place is awful. But you might very well understand, because you could have faced a similar frustration and be able to strike a stance with them to say, let's you and I try to figure out within this context how to work with it so that your child gets what they need. That you can walk away from that, I think, with a lot of improvement in a relationship, because they'll see you struggling with them in the same ways that they are, and struggling not just for your own benefit but for theirs too. Okay, so that's it for the content of this lesson here, and I'm trying to give you a easy, light start for the term in terms of work. So you just have the journal entry, which is the nurturing pedagogy journal entry that has two parts to it to do as assignments. So those are due on Sunday, the 1st of September, I believe. And so, as some of you have already done, please reach out to me if you need anything or if you have any confusion. I've tried to be real clear about what the assignments are and where the due dates are. But I do think some have had trouble maybe locating where the due date is listed. So try to find where the due date's listed for all these assignments so that you know. And otherwise, good luck with a good start to the semester, and I'll be in touch soon about meeting in September.